And then next up, we have part 5, right? In that one, we'll be covering VPC endpoints, VPC interface endpoint, and a private link. Again, even if you're new, at the end of it, you will know in one sentence, what do those services do? So this is where we stopped before, right? So I'm just moving my cursor a bit to the right. To make some space, I'm adding one more region in here, and then within that region, I'm adding a VPC. In this case, I'm calling this a service consumer VPC because it will be accessing some service from another VPC, which is called a service provider VPC. Now, if these two VPC within this region wanted to access content from each other, right? How does it work? So I'm adding an availability zone, a public subnet, a private subnet, and then what else can happen? So I'm adding some EC2 instances in there. These EC2 instances are not shown to be in availability zone or subnets, but they actually are. So for the sake of space, I am not adding those extra stuff in there. But you get the point. So EC2 instances always have to be in certain availability zones and certain subnets and things like that. So now if this EC2 instance wanted to access some services from this VPC, how does it do it? It happens through something called private link, right? And then always there should be an elastic network interface. So consider this one like a card or something that you put in there that they access the other services, I would say outside services from this VPC. Again, so what does elastic network interface do? And more specific, I won't go into details, but it is a tool through which you can access other services outside the VPC. So in the service consumer VPC, we always have ENI or elastic network interface, and then into the service provider VPC, we always have a network load balancers. It cannot be in other way around, right? We cannot have a network load balancer in service consumer VPC in order to have a private link. So whenever that you wanted to access something from another service, so the provider VPC will have the network load balancer, the consumer VPC will have the private link in there. So it goes from this EC2 through the private link, through the network load balancer, and the network load balancer is going to divide the content to the different EC2 instances, right? So this is what a private link is. You have ENI, in consumer VPC, you have network load balancer in provider VPC, and always the traffic has to initiate from the service consumer VPC, which has the ENI in it, and then reach out to the service. So it cannot go the other way around. It has to be from here, from consumer VPC into the provider VPC. Now we go through another concept, which is the endpoint interface, right? So again, if you wanted to, I would say, access certain services within the AWS, right? How do you do that? So we have two different concepts. We have an endpoint interface and we have an endpoint gateway. Again, similar to NAT Gateway in NAT Instance, when it has the gateway thing, is being, I would say it's being managed by AWS, right? So we have the endpoint gateway, it's being managed by AWS. You don't have to worry about the management, patching and kind of updating and everything. AWS is doing that. But if it's an interface, it's kind of, you can customize it and you can configure it in certain ways that you want to do that. So now, like, what's the difference? So if there's a DynamoDB and an S3, it always use an endpoint gateway. So strictly endpoint gateway is only used for DynamoDB and S3. Again, DynamoDB is a database or a storage, right? And S3 is like a block storage. This is more kind of like a database thing. And this is where you have, I would say, item more organized and structured. Sometimes they can be unstructured as well, but like compared to S3, S3 kind of can hold everything. And S3 can hold even a static website and can hold, for example, your photos and everything. Like S3, I have an interface where I'm uploading my own personal photos into S3. So the S3 can hold any kind of information in there. It's kind of like called, I won't go into details because that would be too much, I would say at this point. And then if you have something, I would say, other than DynamoDB and S3, like Redshift, SNS, Lambda. So those are again other services. We will talk about them later, but imagine those are other services in AWS. You wanted to access them from a VPC. How do you do that? You do that through the endpoint interface. So one way is, what can happen is, like if anything, the EC2 instance wanted to access the Redshift, one way can does that is go through the internet gateway out into the internet into the Redshift. That's possible. But if you wanted to make it more faster, what you do is you simply add your interface endpoint, then it is within AWS network backbone. It's much more faster, more secure. And this is how you're going to be reaching out to them. So from the endpoint interface into those different services, from endpoint gateway into the DynamoDB and S3 specifically. And then what else do I have? Oh, the concept of router in the internet gateway. I think so I was going to like mention it somewhere here, which I didn't, but actually traffic coming from the internet gateway always have to go through the router, and then the routers have the route tables, and then has the information how to route the traffic from the internet to the services inside of VPC. So that's what I have. Okay, so in terms of like what a DynamoDB is, you can consider that a secure storage in our castle analogy, and then S3 can be like a public storage. Again, S3 can become, I would say, private as well if you choose to select to make it not public, right? And then what else do we have? Let's see. Okay, so this is the concept like how endpoints can look like. So S3 and DynamoDB, you go through the gateway endpoint, and then any other service you go through the interface endpoint. And for the private link, it's kind of like a bit bigger, I would say, image as compared to what I had before, but it's again service consumer VPC, service provider VPC. You have network group balancer in here. You have your ANI service consumer VPC, and then between you have private link. It's more secure and more faster.